Alright chat, are you here for a big revelation? Because the topic of this video is not just going to be Lynn stuff from Xenoblade X Definitive Edition, but also a discussion on how Lynn is, if not literally the main character of X, she is the protagonist in the sense of inflicting the most change on others, changing the most herself, and generally being not only the moral core, but the heart of the main cast. This video will require spoilers for Xenoblade X and the new content in DE, as well as Xenoblade 1, but not for anything about games connecting to each other, just because I'd like to point out that Lynn is actually Shulk. Or rather, a less hyperbolic way to say it is that Lynn is a contrasting character to Shulk that has a lot of similar story beats around her, though the direction she goes is different because overall, as a person, she is different from Shulk. So, like, she's an engineer developing weapons for a military who lost her parents at a young age and more or less got taken in as an honorary family member of a certain subset of that military unit. She views her continued work on a certain piece of technology that no one's been able to figure out yet as continuing on her parents' legacy, as they were heavily associated with that technology being known about in the first place. She grows, has a few coming-of-age moments, is forced to go face-to-face with the darker parts of humanity, making her final goal to understand why fighting keeps occurring, and then stop that fighting. One of the major tragedies she has to face along the way is that her father figure ends up betraying the party, and he serves as the second-to-last major boss in the game. Also, Lynn, not Elma, is the narrator of the opening cutscene of Xenoblade X. This is a role shared by Shulk in Xenoblade 1, Rex in Xenoblade 2, and Noah in Xenoblade 3. Also, yeah, she's definitely Shulk because she's wearing a Monado on her head, and they only took one of those out in DE, so it's still there. That's the Monado girl. The immediate big point of difference is, of course, that Shulk is the one who's actively seeking revenge himself, and by realizing that that is a bad thing, he directly stops the perpetuation of the cycle of revenge by choosing not to continue it with his own actions, while Lynn is already against that idea and is instead able to stop the cycle by talking Lau and Elma down from continuing it. And that's kind of the key difference between Lynn and Shulk when we really get down to it. Shulk is absolutely the central figure of his party by the end of the game, but through most of it, a lot of the renown and legitimacy they have comes from the fact that Dunban is there. Lynn is never really the central figure for the party, ever. The general renown coming from Elma and later Al, and obviously she is a child, so she can't really be expected to lead in an organizational capacity, but she is definitely the emotional core of the narrative, and her hope and optimism is what causes things to start turning around overall. Is Shulk hope-pilled by the end of Xenoblade 1? Absolutely. But is the hope coming from inside the house? Not really. It's mostly a case of Fiora ending up being alive, them realizing that there are good people of Mechonis as well, and the entire world coming together that gets his entire outlook to change. While Lynn is the one changing other people's outlooks, because while she is a teenager, she does still have that childlike quality of not even understanding why people would be bad to each other in the first place. And that's enough to start getting the older people to start being ashamed of their actions and actually fix things. And that's kind of the big thing about the epilogue. Even though Al shows up, so we've now got 3 people in him, Elma, and Cross who have active main character energy, Lynn is actually the one who's able to take in everything she learned from her character arc throughout the entire base game and become an inspirational figure, the way a typical hero would. Like, you want to say Elma did the majority of the protagonist things in the base game? Sure, fine. And Al was very clearly the hero of a story that happened prior to the base game. Lynn is the one who grows and changes and then reflects that growth on the world to make everyone better. During the original story, a lot of the stuff around Lynn is the typical things that you would expect when there's one child character in a group of adults. Her being younger is a metaphor for innocence and purity and all the things that we want to protect by keeping humanity alive. And because she's a kid, she represents the next generation that humans will be able to have if we find a way to make a life on Mira and all that stuff. While she finishes the flight module, and that is an absolutely massive deal, the way Lynn contributes to the convictions of everyone else is largely for what she is and represents, but starting with her late game conversations with Lau and continuing to an even greater degree through the epilogue, It instead becomes more about who she is and how her actions inspire other people. Who's the one to sit down and have a conversation directly with Cross about who Al actually is, why he is the way he is, and what he means to everyone? It's Lynn. She's annoyed that she wasn't able to work on the Ares there, but would anyone else really be able to have this conversation with us this well? I don't think so. I think this is where she was more useful, honestly. I think it's also really crucial that she does point out that because she's been through a lot, Al's words don't hit the same way they used to, and she's unable to take things at face value. This means that all her later actions aren't a case of just pure idealism and belief that everything's going to be perfect always, because she's not that person anymore. She's been through a lot and matured because of that, but is instead under the much more realistic mindset of doing what she can to make things better as best as possible because it's the right thing to do. Bit of a subtle difference, but I think it is an important shift in her mindset, and I also think it allows her to understand Al better, because she has now been through tragedy, besides the destruction of Earth of course, in a similar way to how he did. This is also why I don't trust people who complain about Act 2 of Chapter 13, saying it's the most pointless part and full of filler, because not only does it have the best written dialogue in the entire epilogue, but it is also Lynn putting all of this into action. Not only is she a vital driving force behind Project Exodus 2 getting done so quickly and so efficiently, but also via reaching out to people and understanding their grief, actively saves people from committing suicide with the loss of Mira. Lynn tends to resent what she sees as being coddled and the fact that she's a child being used to prevent her from helping out in certain ways or doing certain things, to the point where she doesn't realize that her just straight up being herself is a different kind of major boon to Blade. Just look at the last cutscene of the Amomo section. She seems to still carry a lot of imposter syndrome, probably due to her young age and trying to live up to her parents and their accomplishments, to the point of not really being able to fully accept praise even when it comes from someone as close to her as Al is. And that reaction to praise comes on the back of her being hard on herself for thinking she knew better than Amomo, when all she ever did in that scene was a pretty immediate and visceral reaction to hearing that someone didn't want to get onto the White Whale too. I'd also wager that this is affected by her seeing a bit of a kindred spirit in Amomo, who wants to stay behind in part because she feels like she'd be a burden on her loved ones. And I do sometimes get the impression that Lynn feels a bit guilty of forcing Team Elma to have to take care of her in a way that they wouldn't any other soldier on Mira. It might be another inversion thing as well. Amomo doesn't want to be a burden on her living relatives, while Lynn doesn't want to be a burden on the memory of her dead parents. Honestly, it seems like Lynn was the first person to even get the true explanation out of Amomo, because from what we hear from Kylie later on, it seems like the only thing she ever told her was the first part about wanting to be by her husband's grave. Then after that, Elma just explicitly takes a mentorship role, teaches Lynn the lesson to take away from that, and is able to help her work through the fact that, yeah, sometimes you do need to make tough decisions, and there's not necessarily a right answer to every situation like this. I hate to keep harping on this, but that's pretty much a Dunban and Shulk conversation. And the key thing with all this is, Lynn does completely understand Amomo's position by the end of everything, and is willing to, at least reluctantly, accept the fact that she's choosing to stay, and despite coming to that understanding, is still able to convince her to leave. This entire concept and type of interaction is more or less the point of the Xeno series storytelling overall. Not just accepting people from wildly different backgrounds. Hey, I wonder what Xeno means, by the way. But also understanding them, and using that understanding to push for a brighter future for everyone. One might even say that the future is overflowing with hope, but it does still take everyone working together to fully realize all that. Here we go, we got the Xenosaga reference in for this video. Round of applause now, and also in the comments, drive up the engagement that way. Or, to put things in a way someone familiar with Xenoblade X would understand better, Lynn and Amomo both know that whatever's happening in the future is bad and is scary. However, Lynn was able to show Amomo some light for now, and give her enough reason to go on the White Whale 2 and take the chance of wherever that ship would end up leading people. Act 2 is basically Lynn inadvertently going around Mira, finding people who don't want to leave it, and going, look, I get it, I understand why you're out of hope, but I still have plenty, so for the time being, feel free to borrow some of mine. I will be writing that one down because unless I accidentally stole it from somewhere, that sounds really good and I can probably use it somehow in the future. And while I do still want to talk about the Ted portion of Act 2, we have to loop back to the beginning of the act and remind ourselves of the most important person Lynn was able to change the mind of by making them see the light. And that is, of course, Lao. Go back, double check the conversation Lao and Al have on the beach. What people are actually mentioned in that entire conversation period? Well, Lao mentions his wife and daughter by name. Okay, that makes sense. They died before him. He's going to go see them now that he's in the afterlife too. Al says the word princess once, but he's not directly referencing Elma, only the fact that he used to be on her team, and never directly refers to her as a character. Only other person who's name dropped in this scene? Lynn. Lao, of course, is expressing regret for what he did to the entirety of humanity, but he also specifically, on the micro scale, and this seems to be what hit him hardest, regrets what he put Lynn through as a result of his betrayal. He even gives Al a message to pass on to Lynn. And it's just a simple message of encouragement, getting her to realize that she is a good person and maybe not have as many regrets surrounding him. Could he theoretically have explained what it's like actually to die? That could probably help scientists in NLA or stuff like that. There's a good chance he learned a little bit more about the ghosts through the process of being dead and passing through the rift to somewhere else. He could have told Al any of that kind of stuff. He could have written an actual apology for Al to give to everyone and formally apologize for everything he did beyond what he says in the final cutscenes. But he didn't. All he did was send a message to Lynn, trying to make sure that she doesn't blame herself for the fact that he betrayed everyone and then died. What was the message Lao had for her? Live. What was the message Lynn tried to impart to both Momo and Ted later on in the same act? Live. And they did. More or less immediately after that, the party confronts Void again, and we see Lynn at just about the angriest I think she ever is throughout the entire game. I mean, technically she's jokingly angrier at Tatsu, but I don't think that really counts. And interestingly, Elma gives her the opposite lesson here compared to what she's going to say later when they're talking with Momo. And that is, don't try to understand him. I think you have to remember here that the party themselves only ever interacted with Luxar during Chapter 12 of the original game. That is the first time he directly sees any of them and probably directly speaks to any of them besides Lao. So despite her long resume so far, Lynn is actually surprisingly inexperienced when it comes to face-to-face confrontations with big bads. Even if it may seem so on face value, this is not incongruous with any of the anti-revenge and trying to avoid killing at all costs things from games like Xenoblade 1 or Xenoblade 3. Elma is more or less reminding Lynn that, yeah, she was able to talk Lao down and come to an understanding with him, but that's not necessarily going to be the case every time someone is against you. It's okay to want to see the best in people, but try not to get rage baited by actual Satan. It's not a perfect analog, but going back to Xenoblade 1, because I already spoiled the entire thing earlier in this video, why not? Lao might serve a lot of the purpose in Lynn's development that Dixon did for Shulk, but narrative-wise and character-wise, he's much closer to Egil than any other antagonist from Xenoblade 1. Void is very, very similar to Zanza in a lot of regards. And if you go back to Xenoblade 1, none of the revenge stuff is ever really brought up when it comes to Zanza. Everyone's just like, nah, we should probably kill this guy, and then they just do. No one really tries to moralize with Shulk about killing Zanza, and he's at least what I would still classify as a person by the time they kill him. Based on what happened to Void, I'm not sure he really even counts as that in a philosophical sense, so it's a very different situation than anything with Lao. While it is tempered a bit by the time you get into the Momo section, presumably because a lot more time passes than you think between cutscenes, right after this Void encounter is probably the most raw conviction we ever see from Lynn, and her being the one to declare to Vandam that they are going to get Void is honestly a pretty powerful moment for her character. I could not see the Lynn from the beginning of the game doing something quite like this. Circling back again to Lao on the beach, he specifically describes Mira to Al as a welcoming place, and this is not long after talking about Lynn's empathy and how she is a good person. So the implication is that Lynn's actions are a lot of what caused Mira to become this kind of welcoming place. Al is the hero. Al makes his triumphant return, just as Lao predicts. It is in part thanks to Al and the Ares that Void is defeated and everyone's able to escape Mira before it's destroyed. But Al only shows up at the end, and that's a common criticism of the epilogue story. However, if you read between the lines of what Lao is saying here, he's saying that showing up at the end and doing a few hero things because he has the cool robot is all that Al needs to do. The stage has been set for Al's triumphant return, so all he actually needs to do is return, aura farm a bit, ask how it's poppin', and let Cross use the Ares, then collect his check and move on to the new universe. Mira needs to be saved, but it was the people already on Mira before Al got there who put it into a position where it could be saved in the first place. And a whole lot of the work to get there was done by one Miss Lin Li Ku. Lau will be getting his own video soon enough, so I'm not going to talk about his entire appearance in the ending cutscene, but we have to look at what he says to Lin. Thanks to you, my life had some worth after all. This is someone who views himself as the scum of the earth saying this, so we do have to take that with a grain of salt and not treat it completely literally, but he feels that. And giving a sense of worth to someone who previously didn't have any is kind of a pretty big deal. You do that for me a lot more than you think, so thank you for everything. But yeah, because of Lin, someone who led the life Lau did was able to say, yes, I am going to pass on, I am at peace, I want to see my family, but yes, I do think it was a good thing that I was alive. And the thing he had to say to her was, live on. In an Act 2 conversation with Al, Lin more or less makes this explicitly clear. It's mostly pretty typical Xeno stuff about how connections with each other are important, and we live on in the people we knew after we're gone, but she does directly shout out Lau. And this is after she received the message from Lau. So what she's basically saying here is that Lau passed on willingly, but Lin has basically inherited not only his will in general, but specifically his will to live. There's enough talk in the epilogue about the concept of the soul, where the soul exists, and Elma's mentioning the word enlightenment directly, that leads me to believe that a new hanging plot thread with the X side of the series is something that has to do with humans becoming enlightened. I'm thinking probably in some kind of Buddhist sense, and ascending to be some kind of being that's more than human in some undefined way because of their mastery of knowledge of the human soul. Is Lin already this nebulous kind of enlightened person? No. Is she likely to be the first if we directly see this happen on screen? Also no, definitely behind Cross and Al in that regard, but she seems to be a little bit there with whatever this soul thing is. Is it coincidence that she gets the message and is resolved to live on because of Lau, then helps Momo choose to live on, then talks to Al about this, and then helps Ted choose to live on? I don't necessarily think so, even though I am probably reading into this a little bit harder than the subtext was intentionally written to go. Alright, you might be wondering why I've been dancing around the Ted portion of Act 2 for this entire time, and that's because I needed to save his part for last, because now we need to enter the secret section of the video. Unironic Tatsu praise. Terrifying. Yeah, in the parts of Act 2 I haven't talked about yet, Lin does not have a lot of lines, but that's not why I skipped them. I wanted to save this part for last. Do I think it is a dumb plot point that Tatsu is the one to suggest putting genetic information from Mira on the White Whale too? Yes, I do. But in canon, he was the one to suggest it, so we're gonna have to roll with that, and looking into it, where could he have gotten the idea for that from other than Lin? Even if he got the name wrong, Tatsu understands what genetic information is, understands that it can be digitized, and seems to have been aware of the Earthlife colonization project and knows that that was a thing they did with the first White Whale, so they could probably do this with the more advanced second White Whale. Memes and the fact that he's 13 and not a super genius like Lin aside, Tatsu isn't exactly the brightest, so first case, kudos to Lin for explaining all this to him in a way he could understand. Second thing, and memes aside again, I will be saying this a lot, Tatsu and Lin do legitimately care for each other. Like, Tatsu is literally Lin's only friend her own age. That's kind of a big deal. And while yes, most of their interactions are her threatening to cook him, they are also both 13 years old. As best as I can remember, a very large part of being friends with people as a teenager is just being mean to each other as a bit. And then lastly, while we do see Lin's entire character arc play out, the epilogue seems to be indicating that Tatsu also had a massive arc off-screen where he became a legitimately good diplomat and valuable asset of NLA when it comes to interacting with Xenos who haven't moved there already. Yet in the main story, he's already the Nopon emissary to the city, but at the beginning of Act 2, he talks to both the Rothians and the Manon in a way that genuinely seems to bring them together with the blades they're guarding and the rest of the party. And the way he suggests bringing genetic information to Ted is close enough to how other Xenoblade games have depicted actual political negotiation tactics at diplomatic meetings, where I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, honestly. And given how most major characters never really interact or have specific relationships with Tatsu beyond token line swaps and large ensemble scenes, the only person we can really thank for this growth in Tatsu, besides the Nopon himself choosing to lock in at some point off screen, is Lynn. The only person who actively spends a lot of time with Tatsu. Like, this is actual Nopon see, Nopon do stuff. Lynn inherits Lao's will to live, pays it forward in helping a Momo choose to live, and then Tatsu basically replicates what Lynn did before by helping convince Ted to choose to live. And this also obviously makes Lynn really happy too, not just because the guy's alive, but because that's a whole lot more scientific data she can look through. In a weird way, this goes back to religious theming, but not the way you expect. After the Momo segment, when everyone's praising Lynn, Tatsu specifically calls her a saint, and she gets really embarrassed by that. But then Tatsu does something similar to what she did. Almost as if he's literally using Lynn as one might view a saint, as an example for a way to live a good life, and trying to do good in the same way she did. And he succeeds in a way that also has tangible personal benefit to Lynn herself. If you view sainthood as an analog to enlightenment, then this just kinda goes with the entire theme of the epilogue. Knowing death and accepting it when it comes, but living your life in a way to ensure that nobody dies before their time, so that everyone who chooses to seek a future can have it. And if enough people start doing that, it will lead to not only continued existence and prosperity on a societal level, but also, seemingly, some undefined, intangible improvement in the quality of your very being. The quality of your soul, which seems to now be confirmed to exist in Xenoblade X, beyond just having a good moral character from doing this stuff in the first place. I'm not quite sure what all this means, and this speculation might be wrong or never directly addressed in whatever game follows up on the end of Chapter 13, but it's evident even more for the epilogue that our little Linley has sure grown a lot and is becoming a ray of hope to the people of NLA, just like Elma did, just like Al did, and just like Cross did, in her own right and in her own way. And to a lesser extent, perhaps, seemingly so is Tatsu. But Tatsu getting there is largely still because of Lynn. A member of a younger generation learning from those who came before them and finding their own way to become a hero, while also inspiring others of their generation to rise up alongside them? I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty protagonisty to me, and maybe the next X thing will just straight up be from Lynn's POV if they don't want to include an avatar. I think that might actually be pretty cool. Lynn is probably my favorite Xenoblade X character now, and that wasn't even exclusively because of Chapter 13, but just from going through the original story again with fresh eyes and new life experiences for myself, and getting a different point of view because of that. I don't know if you'll necessarily vibe with or even agree with my point of view, but I hope it was at least interesting to watch. Until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.